Welcome, I'm Nina Griffin and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. Today we'll talk about the forecast for November 2022. First off, I wanted to say thank you to all of my patrons. I appreciate all of your support and interest. If you would like to become a patron and get access to other astrologico-magical content, as well as my monthly ebook, Magical Elections, which teaches you how and when to make planetary talismans, you can go to patreon.com/Nina Griffin. When we look at the astrology of November 2022, we can see that the month starts out very strong and punchy, and then the rest of the month really are consequences that are unfolding and developing further from the early part of the month. It may not seem like the rest of the month is relatively quiet, but really what's going on is that the beginning of the month brings in some powerful new influences, and then everything else kind of develops and unfolds from that point. The other thing to notice is that Mercury and Venus will be traveling together this month, though they only exactly conjoin later. They will be very noticeable. They are going to be in Sagittarius much of the time, and especially when they're in that sign, they'll be kind of like a couple of carnies, very loud, possibly offensive intentionally, and really on a quest to grab your attention and ideally your money as well. Sagittarius is one of the so-called loud-voiced signs, and so when planets are passing through it, certainly Mercury and Venus, they are going to be loud and in your face as well. So it could be manifested as a multiplicity of people, since they are two planets that are traveling together. It could manifest as two interlocked influences, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now, the last parts of November will bring some real changes with perhaps less drama than early November, less new things, but it's going to be more weighty in many ways. There's going to be less noise, but more serious, substantive, and real change occurring at that time. Now, the very first week of November is relatively quiet astrologically, but we catch up and make up for it in spades with the second week of November. This starts with November 6th, Venus squaring Saturn at 18 Scorpio and Aquarius. Venus square Saturn is not necessarily a loud aspect, but it's one where we see a distinct tension between enjoyment, represented by Venus, and restriction or authority, represented by Saturn. That tension is going to be particularly noticeable because Venus is in her detriment in Scorpio, so it's going to feel like issues around women, issues around perhaps the LGBTQ community, who are all represented by Venus, are going to be oppressed in some way. But it could also be ourselves, our own Venusian side is somehow brought down and feeling a little bit oppressed around November 6th. Now, November 8th is going to be a very exciting day. It is the lunar eclipse at 16 Taurus occurs then. Now, eclipses always bring drama and sometimes significant change. It's a little hard to know at the beginning whether this is just drama or whether it's drama that will lead to something important. This eclipse is ruled by Venus in detriment, which again suggests difficulties for women and the LGBTQ community. I'll be releasing a separate video about this eclipse for patrons, so stay tuned for that. But just know that it brings about significant changes in locations where the eclipse connects with important national and personal charts. It has the potential to change the balance of government, certainly. If you use the outer planets, you know that this eclipse is strongly configured with Uranus, the planet of dramatic change, especially dramatic change on a collective level. It's also going to be squaring Saturn, so there is a sense here of oppression, and particularly the fight between anarchy on the one hand and oppression or authoritarianism on the other. So of course we have our midterm elections in the United States happening November 8th. So this eclipse very much picks up those themes and makes them a big part of this election and what follows. The very same day, Mercury will conjoin the Sun at 16 Scorpio. This is a superior conjunction wherein Mercury is direct and embarks on a new synodic cycle with the Sun. So it can indicate a new beginning. Now, because this is happening in a sign of Mars, it's going to be a new beginning in the matters ruled by Mars. So new conflicts or new phases to a longer pre-existing conflict can now occur, We could certainly see this in terms of war, like the war in Ukraine, lots of wars going on, lots of conflicts. But know that this particular conjunction will begin a new phase of being for Mercury. Mercury following this point is going to be an evening planet or an evening star, meaning that it's going to rise after the sun. In Scorpio particularly, he is going to be very quiet, more subversive. This is going to be Mercury, who's much more into sabotage and into walking quietly and carrying a big stick, right? He's not going to be very noticeable Mercury, but it's still a very martial Mercury as long as he remains in Scorpio. So his aims are going to be those of Mars, of disruption, of bringing people apart rather than together. This is what Mercury does in a Mars sign. Again, the same day, November 8th, Mercury will oppose Uranus at 16 Scorpio and Taurus. So what I just described, it adds chaos, explosiveness, sometimes literally, always a sense of a shakeup and a need to reestablish balance and homeostasis. On a personal level, November 8th is probably not a great day to try to settle anything, get kind of a finality for anything. Really, this is really more about sort of exploding the status quo rather than establishing a new status quo. And so it's important to recognize that the energy at this moment around November 8th really favors making big changes rather than keeping things the way that they are. The very next day, November 9th, Mercury will square Saturn at 18 Scorpio and Aquarius. Mercury is not done yet with his mission, and he challenges the status quo represented by Saturn. So I think in many ways this is going to be the theme for that first third of November, which is going to keep unfolding for the rest of the month and probably actually for a little longer than that. So Mercury is really on a mission to kind of change things from the inside, maybe, but definitely make changes, and those changes can be pretty drastic at times. Certainly he will be challenging Saturn, who represents the established order, who represents intense control. November 11th, the Sun will square Saturn at 18 Scorpio and Aquarius. Since Mercury is with the Sun, it's kind of like Mercury now has leadership and visibility on his side, right? The Sun always adds visibility, it adds brilliance. So conflicts and the retooling of alliances and former boundaries will now be underway. And this actually makes sense because, of course, after the US elections, there will likely be realignments that need to happen. And what we're seeing here is basically that intense, perhaps behind the scenes work that we're going to see following the election. Now, the third week of November starts off for us astrologers, November 15th. Venus will trine Jupiter, who's retrograde, at 28 Scorpio and Pisces. This combination is Venus's attempt to bring attention and justice to a long-standing situation that has been perceived as unfair. However, Jupiter is retrograde, and so his ability to help is very limited. Remember that a retrograde planet is unable to bring their full energy to a matter, even if it's something that they really want. This could manifest in the judicial context in society, but also financially because Jupiter rules the markets as well. In terms of weather, this could actually be a rather wet week because Venus and Jupiter tend to bring moisture, and in this case, they're both in water signs. So there could be a lot of precipitation going on depending on where you are in the world. On a personal level, this is an opportunity to bring a little bit of harmony into your life after that intense first half of November, which just kind of shook everything up. So if you do want reconciliation, if you do want to bring some kind of soothing balm to a situation, this is probably the right time to do it when Venus trines Jupiter. The same day, right after this, Venus will enter Sagittarius. Now, this is an improvement for Venus because she enters the sign where she is no longer in detriment. She doesn't have a lot of dignity in Sagittarius, so she's still going to be peregrine a lot of the time, but nonetheless, she is no longer actively in detriment. When she is in Sagittarius, this is the sign of projectile weapons. Sagitta means arrow, and so this is what it is. This is the only zodiac sign that actually has a weapon as its symbol. Venus, when she is in Sagittarius, will represent things like justice, but also shiny new weaponry, right? It's excitement about the beautiful weapons, if you will. November 16th, Mercury will trine Jupiter at 28 Scorpio and Pisces, So Venus, in her attempt to try to get justice, has a mercurial ally, but Mercury also has little strength in Scorpio, so he is, I think, unable to get Jupiter to really act decisively in Venus's favor. Right? There's going to be a real push here to try to help Venus, who has been suffering by being in detriment. However, Mercury is not in a position to make that happen. If there are storms, or if there's rain, as I discussed earlier now, they're probably going to persist. They'll be strengthened by that Mercury-Jupiter trine. November 17th, Mercury will enter Sagittarius, which is a loss in dignity for Mercury. He will now be in the sign of his detriment, and so he really enjoys slinging barbs of offensiveness or unvarnished truth. I'm not talking necessarily natally, but certainly he might represent people who are being very loud, very offensive, and intentionally so in order to gain some kind of advantage. So Mercury and Venus together could represent a group or a pair of outrageous and shocking individuals who now have everybody's attention. November 19th, Mercury will square Neptune at 22 Gemini and Pisces. I think that this is a combination of divisiveness, of public lies, obfuscation. They're all going to be part of this combination. Sometimes these can be disasters as well. Neptune has that particular disaster-causing quality where it impacts a number of people at once. So it could be anything from flooding to fires, anything that can create kind of a large situation of chaos. November 20th, the Sun will trine Jupiter at 28 Scorpio and Pisces. This trine comes shortly before Jupiter's turning direct, and it can be a helpful day to use if we want to start something or make a good impression. Jupiter, of course, is still retrograde. However, we have an opportunity here, again, to bring a little bit of harmony into a month that otherwise can feel a bit chaotic, unsettled, full of conflict, full of loud and noisy statements. November 21st, which starts week 4, Mercury will conjoin Venus at 7 Sagittarius. Finally, these two conjoin after having traveled together for so long. It's not necessarily a major power aspect. These are both inferior planets, but it will nonetheless be very public and very noticeable. There's certainly a lot of focus on public speech and throwing barbs. November 22nd, the Sun will enter Sagittarius. The Sun isn't far behind Mercury and Venus. Like a king who enters his domain after his minions, Mercury and Venus, go ahead of him and announce him, right? So there is this sense here that the Sun, Mercury, and Venus are now in Sagittarius, and they are kind of taking up all of the oxygen in the room. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw individuals with strong Sagittarius placements take center stage now and really kind of revel in the loud statements and in the chaos that they are causing. November 23rd, Jupiter will station direct at 28 degrees Pisces. This is a very important planetary event, one that indicates a return to jovial business as usual. This is the business of religion, genuine spirituality if we are lucky, usually on a personal level, and also the potential for generosity. So the outpouring of support for Ukraine, for example, that we saw in the early part of the year may return now. A lot of that was happening with Jupiter in Pisces direct. So I think there is going to be some kind of a realignment, but also a return to an earlier, more sympathetic approach to what is going on with the Russia-Ukraine war. The same day, November 23rd, we will have a new moon at 1 Sagittarius. This is ruled by Jupiter stationing direct in Pisces, representing a return to power. In Washington, D.C., Mars will be retrograde in Gemini on the ascendant for this new moon, suggesting battles in the body politic and the struggle of people or groups who are represented by Mars and their struggle to stay above water. Again, Mars retrograde is going to be very weak. He will be on his back foot and at a disadvantage. The next day, November 24th, Mercury enjoys his evening rise. He emerges from the sun's rays now, and it's an important moment for a planet who has now been fully cleansed and purged in the fiery furnace of the sun. Generally, this is a moment of revelation of prior plans and schemes that were previously hidden. So, as they say, watch the space around November 24th. The 5th week of November, November 28th, we're going to get a Mars retrograde trine Saturn direct at 19 Gemini and Aquarius. This is Mars, who's very weak right now, appealing to help from powerful Saturn, but it's not clear how much help Saturn is willing to give. It may not be an overt conflict, but because there is no reception of Mars by Saturn, it's not clear whether Saturn's really going to be in a mood to help Mars very much. November 29th, Mercury will oppose Mars retrograde at 19 Sagittarius and Gemini. I think that this is going to be a very important aspect. It doesn't seem that big, but it's going to be pretty major. And this is really Mercury and Venus getting their opportunity to get a dig at Mars. Mars has been struggling in the background since turning retrograde in late October. So Venus and Mercury can drive in their daggers now, if you will, in places that are at literal war. Late November could be a time of a new assault and offensive movements, probably on multiple fronts, since Mercury and Venus are two planets and in a sign of duality as well, which is Sagittarius. So this is going to represent some kind of important area of battle, right? Metaphorically or literally, but it's definitely going to represent some kind of intense culmination of perhaps a longer period of preparation that has now emerged. It could manifest a lot of locations. We can't forget that Mars in Gemini is particularly configured to the United States. November 30th, Venus will oppose Mars retrograde at 18 Sagittarius and Gemini, and this is really just that part of what I was describing, Mercury and Venus almost simultaneously opposing Mars. So this is going to be a big culmination. And it's interesting that this is one of the very few oppositions that we actually see in November. And I would argue that perhaps this is really the most important one of the entire month. So to summarize, November is going to be an active month, starting with the eclipse, but really with a lot of intense aspects throughout the month. Again, it's going to entail a lot of shifts, a lot of reconfigurations, as well as a lot of alliances being made and remade. If you want to get a larger picture of what is going on this year and how November falls into that larger picture, you should go to my 2022 year ahead forecast. Thanks for watching. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel.